The morning of October 2025 broke over Salinas Valley State Prison with the same indifferent stillness that settled over the institution every day. The sun was barely cresting the hills, casting long, thin shadows through the layers of razor wire that wrapped around the sprawling complex. For most inmates, the recreation yard offered the closest thing to open space they would feel in years. Concrete ground, steel fencing, and a patch of sky. But within these walls, freedom was an illusion. Every step, every look, and every breath was shaped by the ruthless hierarchies that governed life inside. Unspoken rules dictated survival, and at the very top of that brutal chain sat the Aryan Brotherhood, a gang whose authority carried as much weight as the prison administration itself. On this morning, a storm was about to break in the yard, cold, calculated, and delivered with the deadly efficiency that only decades of hardened violence could produce. Todd Fox Morgan, a 57-year-old man who had spent more time in prison than in the free world, walked into the recreation yard unaware that he had only minutes left to live. Morgan carried a reputation forged in the fire of the state's most violent institutions. To some inmates, he was a respected shot caller, tied to large-scale drug operations that reached beyond the prison walls. To others, he was a man navigating dangerous internal politics that could shift without warning. He was serving a life sentence for robbery, burglary, and assorted convictions accumulated over the years, along with a concurrent 21-year federal sentence for orchestrating a drug trafficking network behind bars. On paper, Morgan was just another inmate. In reality, he was a figure of influence, one whose death would send shockwaves throughout California's correctional system. At approximately mid-morning, the yard was alive with the usual rhythm of movement. Men walking in controlled circles, quiet conversations near the pull-up bars, and COs observing from their posts. Nothing about the scene hinted at what was coming. But for three inmates, Todd J. Givens, Robert England, and Rayan Waldron, the moment had been predetermined, rehearsed, and sanctioned long before they ever stepped into the yard. Surveillance cameras captured them, positioning themselves with the subtle timing of predators waiting for an opening. They were not men acting impulsively or out of desperation. They were a team. They were prepared. And they carried with them the most feared weapons inside any maximum security prison. Inmate-manufactured blades designed to end a life in seconds. What happened next unfolded with startling speed. As Morgan walked along the yard, Givens, England, and Waldron closed the distance in a fluid, coordinated formation. Officers watching from the tower later described the attack as swift and merciless, a textbook example of a prison assassination. The assailants struck with improvised knives, sharpened metal pieces wrapped in cloth to create grips, which slashed and punctured with terrifying efficiency. Morgan tried to defend himself, but there was no escaping a three-man assault delivered at close range, with each blow intended to inflict maximum damage. Within seconds, his body was collapsing beneath him, and the yard descended into shouts, alarm whistles, and the pounding of boots as officers rushed to intervene. By the time correctional staff reached the scene, the attack was over. The three suspects dropped their weapons or allowed them to fall as officers ordered compliance. Morgan lay on the concrete, bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. Even in a system accustomed to violence, the sheer ferocity of the assault drew immediate alarm. Morgan was transferred to medical care, but the injuries were catastrophic. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. 3 homemade weapons were recovered, confirming what the surveillance footage had already shown. This was not a spontaneous brawl or an act of self-defense. It was an execution carried out with purpose. The aftermath set off immediate lockdown procedures across multiple units. Givens, England, and Waldron were removed from the yard and placed into restrictive housing, the standard response for inmates involved in serious assaults or homicides. But even in those first chaotic hours, correctional officials recognized that this killing was far from simple. Morgan was not just another inmate. He was a reputed Aryan Brotherhood figure, a man whose death could ignite further violence, trigger internal reorganization, or reveal deeper fractures within white gang politics inside California's prisons. As staff document the scene, investigators began connecting threads that stretched back nearly 2 years. In January 2024, officers had seized a handwritten note believed to be from an Aryan Brotherhood member. That note specifically emphasized a target, Robert England. The wording was clear, its intent unmistakable. England, one of the very men involved in the attack on Morgan, had himself been marked for death by the gang. The message indicated that England had violated internal codes, allegedly by attempting to greenlight assaults on white inmates without proper justification or authority. In AB culture, this offense was not simply misconduct, it was treason. So how did a man with a death sentence on his head end up participating in the murder of a figure tied to the same organization that wanted him eliminated? That was one of the many contradictions investigators now faced. Was Morgan killed because he refused to carry out the hit on England? Was the hit team itself acting under a splinter directive? Was this a purge, a correction, or retaliation? Prison politics rarely move in straight lines, and in the shadowy world of high-security yards, loyalties shift as easily as sand. In the hours and days following the murder, an unsettling narrative began to form, shaped by interviews with gang intelligence officers, inmate whispers, and evidence pulled from some prior investigations. Morgan's killing was not random. It was not the product of personal beef or spontaneous fury. It bore the hallmarks of an organized, rule-driven assassination rooted in the internal discipline of the Aryan Brotherhood, a group that relies heavily on fear, violence, and absolute control to maintain order within its ranks. England's involvement, despite being a marked man, suggested a chain reaction of events triggered by his earlier misconduct, possibly entangling Morgan in disputes he could not escape. To understand the killing of Todd Fox Morgan, investigators had to follow the trail backward into the life and reputation of one of the suspects now sitting in administrative segregation, Robert England. His name had hovered around Aryan Brotherhood investigations for years, whispered in correctional interviews and scribbled across intercepted notes. By the time Morgan was murdered, England was already living under the shadow of a different kind of death sentence, one not issued by the courts, but by the white prison gang hierarchy that governed life within the walls. England was many things: a lifer, a former biker, a man with a violent history, and above all, someone who had reportedly crossed a line the Aryan Brotherhood considered unforgivable. England was 61 years old, but prison life ages a man differently. His face carried the weight of decades spent navigating the brutal politics of California's penal system. Before he entered prison, he was suspected of ties to the Hessians Motorcycle Club, a group known for its outlaw culture and territorial feuds. Inside, England operated mainly within the white inmate population, though he never rose to the level of a formal Aryan Brotherhood member. Still, the organization expected obedience from any white inmate who benefited from its control, and whether through affiliation or necessity, England fell under that unwritten authority. His criminal record inside prison was extensive, marked by assaults and disciplinary incidents that reflected both impulsiveness and a determination to carve out some measure of power for himself. The trouble began when England was accused of doing something extraordinarily reckless within the prison's subculture. According to gang investigators, England had been trying to orchestrate assaults on fellow white inmates, attacks that were not authorized, not justified, and not sanctioned by the Aryan Brotherhood. In their world, this was more than insubordination. It was destabilization. The AB's rigid hierarchy depended on order, structure, and clearly defined procedures for violence. Every assault had to be justified. Every green light required validation. When England allegedly attempted to circumvent that process, he violated the most sacred rule. He challenged the Brotherhood's monopoly on authority. The consequences were swift, though invisible to the untrained eye. In prison, being greenlit rarely comes with dramatic confrontations. Instead, it appears quietly, like a whisper in a dorm or a pen stroke on a folded piece of paper. In January 2024, officers intercepted one such note. The message, written with unmistakable emphasis, identified Robert England as a target. It was the kind of document that changed a man's life overnight. Once the Brotherhood declared someone a problem, time became a countdown. For England, that countdown began nearly 2 years before the killing of Morgan. The fact that he survived that long hinted at a complex web of alliances, fears, and opportunities that delayed the inevitable. To the Aryan Brotherhood, England's actions went beyond the immediate incidents. His attempts to manipulate violence for personal grievances threatened the delicate balance that kept white inmates unified in a system defined by racial segregation. If England could push assaults without justification, others might attempt the same. Disorder was dangerous. It could fracture alliances, weaken the gang's negotiating power, and open opportunities for rival groups to exploit divisions. In that environment, discipline was existential. Killing a disruptive figure was not just punishment, it was a message. And that message was meant for every white inmate who even thought about stepping outside the structure. What makes England's story more compelling and more confusing is the contradiction at the heart of Morgan's murder. If England was already marked for death, why was he standing beside 2 other violent inmates participating in the killing of a man with Aryan Brotherhood ties? That question baffled investigators, who saw the contradiction not as a mistake, but as a signal that deeper internal fractures were at play. Either someone within the AB had temporarily revoked the kill order, someone else had taken control of England's fate, or the murder of Morgan was connected to England's situation in ways that were not immediately visible. One theory suggested that England may have been acting out of desperation. A man, greenlit, knows that time is not on his side. Participating in a high-profile attack could have been his attempt to demonstrate loyalty, to prove he was still valuable, or to show that he could follow orders if given the chance. Another theory proposed the opposite, that England was compelled or coerced into joining the attack by inmates who saw him as expendable. By involving England in the killing of Morgan, the attackers may have hoped to seal his fate regardless of the operation's outcome. If Morgan survived, England's participation would be seen as an attack on a respected figure. If Morgan died, England would be tied to the fallout. Either way, the move placed him in a position where survival became even less certain. But among all theories, one stood out. Morgan's death may have been tied to England's status as a marked man. If Morgan was seen as slow to act on the green light against England, if he hesitated, questioned the order, or refused to carry it out, then he himself could have been viewed as undermining the Brotherhood's authority. Within such a rigid structure, Hesitation can be interpreted as betrayal. The AB's internal culture does not allow room for mercy or doubt, and mismanaging a kill order is considered a serious violation. If Morgan failed to ensure that England was eliminated, the Brotherhood may have chosen to remove both problems at once, the disobedient target and the reluctant enforcer. Nothing in prison politics exists in isolation. England's troubled history, his reckless maneuvers, and the AB's rigid codes form the backdrop against which the events of October 2025 played out. As investigators pieced together the fragments of information, one thing became clear: England's presence at Morgan's murder was not accidental. Whether he was a pawn, a participant, or a desperate man clinging to relevance, he had become a central figure in a violent feud where the rules were written in blood. Long before the October 2025 killing of Todd Fox Morgan, there was another Todd whose name carried weight in California's correctional system. Todd J. Givens, a man already condemned to death but still feared inside the walls he would never leave. At 56 years old, Givens had spent the bulk of his life immersed in violence, surrounded by racial politics, and shaped by the unforgiving social terrain of high-security prisons. Among inmates and officers alike, he was known not only for his past crimes, but for his unwavering willingness to carry out violent orders. His reputation was that of a man who did not hesitate, did not negotiate, and did not concern himself with consequences. When someone like Givens stepped onto a yard, people took notice, not because of who he was, but because of what he was capable of doing. Givens had deep connections to the Nazi lowriders, a white supremacist prison and street gang that operates in the shadow of the Aryan Brotherhood. While the NLR sometimes acted independently, they traditionally aligned themselves beneath the AB's authority in prison, supporting them in conflicts with rival groups and enforcing racial control on the yards. The NLR's members have long been used as foot soldiers in the larger power dynamics of California's prisons, acting as shock troops who carry out assaults, enforce discipline, or serve as intermediaries for the Brotherhood's more senior figures who try to limit their exposure to direct violence. As a suspected NLR member, Givens was already conditioned for the kind of brutality that marked Morgan's death. Despite being on death row for a prior murder, Givens continued to exercise influence wherever he was housed. In prison, a death sentence does not strip a man of his identity or his ability to operate within gang politics. If anything, it can enhance his standing. A man with nothing left to lose becomes a powerful tool, dependable, fearless, and unafraid of punishment because the worst punishment has already been handed down. For the Aryan Brotherhood, inmates like Givens serve as ideal enforcers, especially when a violent message needs to be delivered quickly and decisively. Whether or not Givens was formally affiliated with the AB, he lived within a structure that required obedience to the gang's unspoken rules, and his participation in the killing of Morgan reflected not only his personal capabilities, but the network of alliances that governed the white inmate population. The attack itself demonstrated Givens's precision. Surveillance footage showed a man who moved with purpose, stepping into his role as if he had done it countless times before. His strikes were controlled, targeting areas of the body where improvised blades could inflict maximum damage. He did not appear to hesitate or react nervously. Instead, he functioned with the cold efficiency of a man who understood exactly what his task was and what the consequences of failure would be. For investigators, Givens's level of commitment raised important questions about who orchestrated the attack and what promises or threats guided his actions. One theory among prison intelligence staff is that Givens acted in alignment with the Aryan Brotherhood's internal discipline system. If Morgan had mishandled the kill order on Robert England, if he had failed to eliminate the target designated by AB leadership, then executing Morgan would have been considered an act of loyalty to the gang's code. Givens, already a known enforcer, would have been a natural choice for such an operation. In this scenario, Givens was not merely participating in a murder. He was carrying out a sentence handed down by a hierarchy that uses violence to maintain absolute control. Another theory suggests that Givens may have had personal frustrations or grievances with Morgan, stemming from conflicts within white inmate politics or disputes over control of contraband and drug markets inside the prison. Morgan's federal conviction for orchestrating a drug operation within the system placed him in a position of power that often intersects with competing interests. If Givens or his allies felt undermined or squeezed out of access to resources, that tension could have contributed to the decision to attack. However, personal motives rarely operate alone in prison gang politics. Even if personal animosity existed, the attack would not have occurred without the tacit approval, or at least the strategic tolerance. For correctional officers who had monitored Givens for years, his involvement in such a violent act was no surprise. They had seen him cycle through yards and units with the same detached resolve. He was a man defined by the system that shaped him, a system where violence becomes a language, a currency, and sometimes a survival mechanism. Officers described him as someone who rarely showed emotion, never tried to ingratiate himself with staff, and avoided unnecessary conflicts. But when violence erupted around him, he never seemed to flinch. Givens was not a man who sought chaos for its own sake. He was a man who understood his role within a rigid and punishing hierarchy. And when the time came to fulfill that role, he executed it without hesitation. In the context of Morgan's death, Givens stands as the anchor of the kill team, the experienced enforcer whose presence signaled the seriousness of the operation. Whether he was acting on direct orders from the Aryan Brotherhood, supporting an allied gang initiative, or pursuing his own motives within the boundaries of white gang politics, one thing was clear: Givens was central to the attack. His long history of violence, his place within the prison's racial structure, and his death row status all contributed to the lethal efficiency with which the murder was carried out. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the environment that produced him, a man forged by years of brutality, shaped by gang codes, and transformed into a weapon used to enforce a system built on fear and control. While Todd J. Givens embodied the role of the seasoned enforcer, the remaining two men involved in the killing of Todd Fox Morgan, Robert England, and Rayan Waldron brought their own histories, tensions, and violent trajectories into the deadly equation. Each man represented a different faction of the white prison underworld, and each carried a past shaped by brutality, gang feuds, and a lifetime of hardened criminality. To understand how Morgan was killed, investigators had to look beyond the immediate act of violence and examine the lives of the two men who flanked Givens in the attack. Together, they formed a triangle of force, but their motivations, affiliations, and personal stakes in the killing were far from identical. Robert England, despite being one of the attackers, was simultaneously the most vulnerable and the most confounding figure among the trio. England, at 61 years old, was the oldest of the suspects, a man whose long history of incarceration had left him both seasoned and deeply entangled in the volatile currents of prison gang politics. Before prison life consumed him, England had been associated with the Hessians Motorcycle Club, a group known for its involvement in outlaw biker culture, drug trafficking, and violent retaliation. Inside prison, those associations carried weight, but also brought complication. Biker gangs and white prison gangs do not always share the same rules, hierarchies, or priorities, and individuals like England are often caught between loyalty to their old world and the realities of survival inside high-security institutions. England was serving a life sentence for murder, with additional time tacked on for in-prison assaults that revealed a pattern of volatility and aggression. He was the type of inmate who had spent years navigating the blurred lines between biker politics and white prison gang expectations. But where England stood in the eyes of the Aryan Brotherhood became increasingly strained over time. His alleged attempts to orchestrate unauthorized assaults on white inmates were not only reckless, but viewed as a direct affront to the Brotherhood's control over violence. In a tightly regulated racial structure, only the AB decides who gets attacked, when, and why. England's attempt to manipulate that system, supposedly for personal grievances, was the kind of transgression that demanded severe consequences. That consequence materialized in January 2024 in the form of a handwritten note seized by correctional staff. Its meaning was unmistakable. England was greenlit. His life was now forfeit, and the Brotherhood expected someone to carry out the sentence. Yet less than 2 years later, England was standing side by side with 2 other violent inmates, participating in the execution of a man rumored to be an AB figure himself. This contradiction became one of the central puzzles for investigators. Had England been temporarily reinstated into the fold? Was he manipulated into joining the attack to seal his own fate? Or was Morgan's death itself connected to England's unresolved status? England's role in the attack was unmistakable. Footage from the yard showed him participating actively, gripping an improvised blade crafted from sharpened metal and wrapped securely for maximum control. His movements were not as precise as Givens's, but they were deliberate. He struck at Morgan repeatedly, driving the blade downward with the kind of desperation that can only come from a man who knows he has no allies left. Whether he acted out of fear, coercion, ambition, or as part of a transactional arrangement with the attackers remains unclear. But one fact is certain. England was not a passive participant. He contributed to the fatal assault with the same intensity as the others. Where England represented desperation and contradiction, Rayan Waldron embodied the deep-rooted force of outlaw motorcycle culture adapted to prison life. Waldron, 51 years old, was a suspected member of the Mongols Motorcycle Club, one of the most powerful and feared biker organizations in the country. The Mongols have a long-standing rivalry with groups like the Hells Angels, but inside prison, traditional biker conflicts often intersect or collide with racial and gang politics. As a Mongol on a California yard, Waldron operated in a complicated space. While bikers maintain their own brotherhoods, they often navigate alliances with racial gangs to ensure protection, influence, and continuity. This creates a network of interdependence where violence becomes both a currency and a method of maintaining status. Waldron was serving a life sentence for a 2003 murder, a conviction that marked him as a man with a long and violent past. Inside prison, he was respected for his toughness, feared for his temper, and known for his willingness to stand firm in conflicts. Men like Waldron often become valuable assets in violent operations, not necessarily because they are loyal to any one gang, but because they bring their own brand of discipline and ruthlessness. Bikers are known for their commitment to a code, and while it differs from the Aryan Brotherhoods, There are moments where those codes overlap, especially when eliminating a common enemy or enforcing shared rules among white inmates. In the Morgan killing, Waldron's role was clear. He was part of the coordinated strike team that moved in tandem to ensure that Morgan would not survive. Surveillance showed Waldron closing in from the side, driving his improvised weapon into Morgan's torso and back during the frenzy of the assault. He struck with force rather than finesse, using his weight and momentum to overpower the older man in the chaos of the attack. Waldron was not the tactical mind of the operation, nor the primary executioner. He was the muscle, an essential component in ensuring the attack's overwhelming brutality. The presence of a Mongol, a former Hessian, and a Nazi lowrider in the same coordinated assassination brought attention to an unusual dynamic. These groups do not always move in perfect harmony. Yet on that October morning, their interests, or at least their willingness to participate, converged. This convergence strongly suggested that the killing was not random, improvisational, or unplanned. Rather, it hinted at a sanctioned operation, whether by the Aryan Brotherhood directly, by a coalition of white inmates responding to internal disorder, or by a smaller faction with its own agenda. England's vulnerability, Waldron's aggression, and Givens's precision formed a lethal combination. The desperation of a marked man, the brute strength of a biker with nothing to lose, and the calculating violence of a death row enforcer. Together, they created a scenario that left Todd Fox Morgan with no chance of survival. The attack was not only swift but symbolic, representing the consequences of violating the unwritten rules that govern the prison underworld.